Don't embarrass me tonight, Clara. Just smile, sip your drink, and let the real professionals do the talking. My husband, Richard, whispered those exact words into my ear as we walked into the grand ballroom of the annual defense gala. He gripped my wrist just tight enough to assert control, utterly convinced I was nothing more than an ornament on his arm. For 7 years, Richard treated me like a meek, quiet housewife whose biggest achievement was keeping the pantry organized. He believed I had spent my entire adult life knowing nothing of the real world. He didn't know about my classified clearance, my decorated service record, or the overseas operations I commanded before transitioning to high-level defense strategy. When a 4-star Admiral suddenly locked eyes with me, snapped to crisp attention and boomed across the room, "Colonel Vance, we've been waiting for you," my husband's entire world imploded. My name is Clara Vance. I am 36 years old, and for the last 7 years, the world around me only knew one version of my existence: Richard's quiet, obedient wife. To our neighbors in our manicured suburban cul-de-sac, I was the woman who tended the hydrangeas, organized the pantry by color, and baked fresh sourdough every Sunday morning. To Richard, a rising executive clawing his way up the corporate ladder at a mid-tier defense contractor, I was an intellectual lightweight, someone whose mind was supposedly unequipped for anything more complex than folding laundry and balancing the grocery budget. Every evening across our dining table, Richard made a point of talking down to me. He would recount his meetings with military liaisons using exaggerated self-importance, always punctuating his stories with patronizing little reminders. "You wouldn't understand the strategic nuances, Clara," he would say with a dismissive wave, leaning back while I poured his wine. "Just stick to what you're good at." I never argued. I simply smiled, nodded, and let his ego expand, watching him mistake my quiet patience for total submission. The dynamic reached a boiling point 3 days before the prestigious annual defense gala. Richard burst through the front door, waving a pair of entry-level contractor passes like they were golden tickets. It was the premier networking event of the year, filled with Pentagon officials, aerospace titans, and high-ranking military brass. But instead of excitement, Richard brought strict rules. "This is my one shot to impress the upper echelon," he warned me that night, his voice sharp and commanding as he paced our bedroom. "I'm only bringing you because spouses are expected. But you do not talk business. You don't ask questions, you don't pretend you know anything about military hardware, and above all, don't embarrass me in front of people who actually matter." I looked at his reflection in the vanity mirror and offered the exact docile nod he expected, quietly keeping 7 years of truth buried just a little longer. The truth was, Richard's complete ignorance about my life wasn't an accident. It was a product of his own towering narcissism. When we met 8 years ago, I had just transitioned off active duty after 12 years in the United States Army, where I had risen through the ranks to become a full colonel in cyberintelligence and special operations. I had led forward deployed teams, architected classified network defenses for Central Command, and earned a chest full of ribbons that were currently locked inside a biometric safe in our basement. When I stepped into the civilian sector, taking a high-level strategic reserve consulting position under direct contract with the Pentagon, I was bound by strict non-disclosure agreements. But Richard never required an NDA to keep him from learning the truth. He never asked. To Richard, my quiet home office behind locked French doors was merely where I did remote clerical data entry for a logistics subcontractor. When the occasional courier arrived with encrypted hard drives, he assumed I was sorting shipping manifests. When I spent 48 straight hours on emergency teleconferences coordinating threat mitigations, he complained that the typing was keeping him awake. He was so utterly consumed by his minor corporate achievements that it never once occurred to him that his unassuming wife was holding a top-secret SCI clearance and advising the Joint Chiefs of Staff. As our black town car pulled up to the Grand Regency Hotel for the gala, the familiar hum of high-security operational protocol washed over me. I scanned the perimeter instantly. Plainclothes Secret Service details on the perimeter, military police at every access checkpoint, and biometric badge scanners at the grand ballroom doors. Richard adjusted his lapels nervously, sweating through his stiff tuxedo collar as he clutched his contractor lanyard like a child holding a golden ticket. Meanwhile, I casually observed the security details, recognizing the exact deployment patterns and tactical communication frequencies I had personally authored and implemented during my tenure at the Defense Information Systems Agency. Walking past the armed guards at the inner threshold, I locked eyes with two security officers whose training files I had personally signed off on 3 years ago. They blinked, recognized my face and began to shift toward attention, but with a subtle split-second shake of my head, I signaled them to stand down. The night was just beginning, and Richard was walking blindly into a world he thought he owned. The grand ballroom was a sea of dress uniforms, medals clinking under crystal chandeliers, and defense executives jockeying for favor. The second we crossed the threshold, Richard physically guided me toward a small cocktail table adjacent to the coat check, well out of the main thoroughfare. "Stay right here," he muttered under his breath, not even looking at me as his eyes darted hungrily across the room. "I'm going to go work the floor. Have a glass of water. Try not to wander off and say something foolish." He turned on his heel and plunged into the crowd, leaving me by the periphery. I stood with my spine straight, holding an untouched champagne flute, quietly taking in the room. I watched defense attaches from 3 allied nations mingling by the stage, recognized several operational analysts I had collaborated with over encrypted channels, and observed the unmistakable tactical discipline of the plainclothes security ring keeping close watch on the inner VIP perimeter. 20 minutes later, a small group of high-profile defense industry leaders and 2 senior Navy captains gravitated toward our corner to escape the crowded center aisle. Richard seized the opportunity immediately, cutting into their circle with an overeager smile and a handful of his business cards. He launched into a loud, rehearsed pitch about his company's new naval logistics interface, dropping buzzwords that revealed just how shallow his understanding of active duty systems really was. One of the officers, a weathered Navy captain named Miller, tilted his head politely and glanced my way to break Richard's breathless monologue. "And what about you, ma'am? Do you think the current Pacific supply chains can handle that level of integration without severe latency risks?" Before I could speak, Richard let out a loud, patronizing bark of laughter that turned the heads of more than 20 surrounding guests, military liaisons and aerospace executives. "Oh, Captain, don't bother asking her," Richard announced loudly, smirking around the circle with performative pity. "Clara's just a simple housewife. She spends her days baking bread and folding napkins. The poor thing doesn't even know the difference between a destroyer and a cruise ship. Leave the heavy thinking to the real professionals." Several civilian contractors chuckled awkwardly, while Captain Miller's brow furrowed in visible distaste at Richard's arrogance. My husband stood tall, grinning widely, thoroughly convinced he had just asserted himself as the dominant alpha in the room. I didn't blink. I didn't flush with anger, nor did I lower my gaze. I simply kept my shoulders pinned back, met Captain Miller's eyes with a cool, calculating calm, and allowed Richard to dig his own grave 1 syllable deeper. The double doors to the private VIP reception suite opened, and the ambient noise in the ballroom dropped instantly. Walking through the cordon of security was 4-star Admiral Harrison, the chief of naval operations and one of the most powerful military officials on the planet. His chest was covered in 4 rows of distinguished service medals, and an entourage of flag officers, senators, and elite defense executives followed closely in his wake. Richard nearly dropped his champagne glass in his rush. His eyes lit up with ravenous ambition, smelling the opportunity of a lifetime. Shoving past 2 mid-level contractors, he positioned himself directly along the Admiral's path, aggressively clearing his throat and holding his company's leather-bound portfolio out in front of him. "Admiral Harrison, sir," Richard piped up, plastering on his most obsequious corporate smile. "Richard Sterling from Apex Logistics. I'd love just 30 seconds to explain how our firm's proprietary platform can overhaul your fleet supply lines." Admiral Harrison didn't even slow down. He brushed past Richard's outstretched portfolio as if my husband were made of thin air. The Admiral's sharp, steely gaze cut across the perimeter, locked straight onto my face, and ignited with immediate recognition. Before the entire room, in front of the 20 contractors Richard had just mocked me to, in front of the tech executives, the Pentagon liaisons, and the entire high command, Admiral Harrison halted. His heels clicked together with razor precision, his right hand rose to the brim of his white service cap, and he rendered a crisp, unwavering military salute. "Colonel Vance," the Admiral's deep voice resonated through the silenced corridor. "We've been waiting for you in the inner briefing room. The Joint Chiefs just reviewed your Pacific Theater threat assessment, and your protocols are already being pushed to the fleet. It is an absolute honor to have you here tonight, ma'am." Behind him, 2 Major Generals and Captain Miller immediately snapped to rigid attention, echoing the salute. Richard's face drained of every ounce of color until he was as pale as a corpse. His jaw went completely slack, his arm hovering in midair holding the rejected folder, frozen in total shock. He looked between the 4 stars gleaming on Harrison's shoulder and the woman he had dismissed as a simple housewife just 2 minutes earlier. The silence around us was absolute. I broke it with a calm, composed nod, stepping out of the shadows. "Thank you, Admiral. Let's get to work." The ride home that night was suffocatingly quiet. Richard gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, glancing at me every 30 seconds as if sitting next to an armed bomb. When we finally hit the highway, the desperate dam broke. "Clara, please. You have to understand," he stammered, his confident executive facade completely shattered into a pathetic plea. "I didn't know. You never told me who you were. If I had known about your rank, about the Pentagon, I was just trying to protect my career. We can use this, Clara. With your connections, Apex Logistics could secure the entire naval contract. Think about what we could build together." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't yell. I reached into my leather handbag, pulled out a manila dossier stamped with the Department of Defense seal, and dropped it onto his lap. "That's the procurement evaluation for Apex Logistics," I said evenly, looking straight through the windshield. As the primary strategic advisor, the final review was on my desk yesterday morning. "Your firm was disqualified. Not out of personal spite, Richard, but because your operational architecture is full of vulnerabilities, and a man with your hollow arrogance lacks the basic integrity required to safeguard national security assets." Richard swerved slightly, staring down at the rejection stamp with hollow, ruined eyes. When we pulled into the driveway, I walked directly into the study, picked up the divorce papers I had quietly finalized 2 weeks earlier, and set them on the kitchen counter beside his cold cup of coffee. I packed 2 duffel bags with my personal belongings and my service medals, leaving behind the house, the manicured hydrangeas, and 7 years of calculated disrespect. I never looked back. I had served my country with honor, and I was done playing small for a man who couldn't even see the giant standing beside him.